I apologise, I'm going to speak in English, but with the help of Martin, I have had him translate the slides, so you'll know what I'm talking about with the help of our translator as well. I'm going to be talking about the importance of an effective security triangle in defending against terrorism and crime on infrastructure and in other important sites. Later on, I'll be talking about some of the standards we've used in the UK to protect our infrastructure for over 20 years because of the terrorism threats we've faced. And talking of that terrorism threat, it came from these guys for many years, the IRA. And they said something quite profound after this attack on the Brighton Grand Hotel, which was hosting the Conservative Party's conference, and they were the party in power at that time in 1983. They said, you have to be lucky all of the time. We only have to be lucky some of the time. And that is so true. Criminals and terrorists and hostile state actors know when, where, and how. It's our job to guess when, where, and how, and make sure we've put in effective measures. We cannot rely on luck. We need to put in good judgment. So what I'm going to talk about is how in the UK and some of the philosophies that help us defend against the many threats that I'm sure you face. Now, while there are many, I am only going to actually present on the one, manual forced entry using tools. And there are many reasons why someone might want to use tools to gain entry. It might be to access information, in which case generally they would try and do it surreptitiously. It might be to access people, and unfortunately in the UK in the last year we have lost one MP who was stabbed by a terrorist or someone with terrorism sympathies. It might be historic crime, theft, acquisition of asset, destroy infrastructure, sabotage, which we've certainly seen over Europe in recent times, certainly in the last year and a half. Or it might be protest. It could be for many reasons. And how they do it will depend on what their objective is and whether they're criminal, terrorist, protester, agitator, or otherwise. They might wish to do it surreptitiously, so without leaving evidence. They might use what we call stealth in the UK. So that's people who have a low appetite for taking risk because they're not expecting much return for what they're about to commit. So they're going to use small tools, easily concealable, and they're going to do it quietly, what we call a cat burglar in the UK. They might use social engineering. Or what I'm going to talk about is standards for forced entry without the fear of making noise, which is generally what we see in the UK, and what I'm sure you'll see here is if someone's going to target you, whether it's a marauding terrorist attack or whether it's an attack on your infrastructure, they know what they're doing, they know you're looking for them, and they just want to do it as quickly as possible. Well, doing it quietly generally isn't very quick, so they will make noise. And they sometimes might do it when there are people around. But the idea for them is shock and awe to achieve their objective as quickly as possible. It might be mob attacks, vehicle ramming attacks, or combinations. Attacking the vehicle bollards and then driving the vehicle through the gap. So how do we defend against this? About 15 years ago, I developed this triangle because I was going to exhibitions and conferences, and there would be a lot of talk about detection. CCTV, when I go to the Middle East, they're very passionate about the use of detection because it tells them something happened. But if that's something sabotage, by the time you've picked it up, yes, you've got the evidence, but you've lost your infrastructure. So it's really important to defend up front. So the point of this triangle is to remind ourselves that we need that delay. And the time you achieve with the delay measures you invest in needs to at least match the time to detect and time to respond. Because if it doesn't, you get what we call an exploitable gap, a vulnerability. That's what the hostile actor is looking to achieve. They're looking to overcome your delay measures to achieve their objective while you're detecting and before you respond. But it's also very important to consider when detection occurs. If you have a fence line but you do not have perimeter detection systems or sterile zone detection on them, while it provides a delay, no one knows it's being cut. So if they don't know it's cut, your detection isn't started, your response doesn't know about it. So your fence, albeit a demarcation, isn't really being effective. So it's really important when you're looking at the triangle, you only count the time from the first point of reliable detection. It's also really important not to underinvest in delay and forget that things like alarm transmission, the point between detection and response, the signal that's going from the one system to the people who are going to deal with it, isn't instantaneous. In the European standard for alarm transmission equipment, you're allowed up to 25 hours for that system to report a fault. That's a very long dotted line, and I can assure you there's very few delay measures that will give you that defence. So it's really important to consider the settings on things like alarm transmission and make sure it's manageable without giving you the false alarms, but it's also manageable in terms of you've invested enough delay to buy the time for that decision to be made. And it's also, albeit it might appear obvious, but we see this being got wrong very often in the UK, is to think about the response in the same way as you're thinking about the deterrence and what that needs to resist. So if your threat is people coming up with explosives, you need people who can respond and deal with explosives. If they're coming in with large petrol-driven tools, they need to be able to deal with that. And when I speak to people in the UK and say, so what is your response? And they say, well, it's a couple of security guards. We don't have armed police in the UK, generally speaking, apart from the nuclear sector. So if it's energy distribution and people turn up, they're going to turn up as two people with a radio and hoping to apprehend. Well, if they're faced by a mob who are well armed, they're not going to be able to defend. They'll be putting themselves at risk. They'll call for backup. That 20 minutes response suddenly becomes 40-minute response. That becomes the exploitable gap. So it's very important that we invest correctly and ensure the delay is there. But it's also very important not to have a siloed view. So in the UK, we've done a lot. We've led the world in terms of hostile vehicle mitigation. The standards, there's a new ISO standard just been published. But what about that bollard that is very easily cut with a power tool? That I can jump out a van, cut the bollard, leaving a very exploitable gap. How quickly could that gap be blocked to stop the vehicle coming through? Is it minutes? Is it hours? It's really important not to think in silos. HVM protection is also vulnerable to manual attack. So, underpinning all that is the delay. And as the equation shown on the previous slide says, we need to make sure the delay matches the sum of detection time and response time. It's the foundation of good security. It sits at the bottom of the triangle. But what confidence can you have that the delay measures you're investing in will provide you that opportunity to detect, respond, and stop that sabotage or other event occurring? Well, sadly, hopefully this will play, because I didn't get a note, it's not going to. 95% of the products that we test, and I've been doing this 27 years, 95% of those products submitted by manufacturers fail to deliver the delay those manufacturers are expecting. That sadly is also true of detection and access control systems we evaluate, where 95% don't meet the European standards. Now, it's a fine line for manufacturers to over-engineer something, especially for forced entry, where you don't know how the laboratory is going to use the tools, and if you don't know how they're going to use the tools, you definitely know how the hostile actor is going to use the tools, because that hostile actor could be one of millions of people. So yeah, 95% of products actually fail to deliver. So it's really important we have a way of benchmarking the performance of that product before we invest in it, and that's where standards come into it. And our standard LPS 1175 has been used, as I mentioned earlier, for over 20 years for protecting critical infrastructure in the UK. And in 2015, it became evident that things were changing, that in the old standard, very much like the European standard 1627, the philosophy was criminals or terrorist hostile actors would use bigger tools for longer. So as you go up through the grading in the European standard from RC1 up to RC6, you get more time from 1 minute or 3 minutes up to 20 minutes, and you get bigger and bigger tools. But the truth is, someone breaking into a jeweller's doesn't spend 20 minutes using the sledgehammer, which is an RC6 tool. They'll spend 1 minute. They're using that large tool to get in very quickly. They're not using this large tool because they think they can spend longer using it. So it didn't work. So we thought we need to go back to basics. So going back to basics for us was going back and understanding what the hostile actors' views were. Who are we trying to stop? And what we realised is actually, unless they're drunk, on drugs, acting under duress, or mentally ill, they would act in an entrepreneurial way, like a business person. They would consider, what return am I looking to get? What level of fear if I'm a terrorist? What level of disruption if I'm sabotage, hostile state actor? If I'm a criminal, what value of the goods am I going to steal? What investment do I need to make to be successful? What tools do I need to acquire in order to achieve my objective? What stamina and strength do I need to overcome these layers of defense? And what risks am I going to face? As security practitioners, we think about risk from our perspective, but so does the hostile actor. Can I make noise? What if I leave evidence? Well, if you're a terrorist, you don't care. Well, certainly, unfortunately, modern terrorists. If you're a criminal, you might. So we've got to really take that into account. And like a business person who will invest when the return outweighs that investment and risk, the same with the hostile actor. The further up the curve of return and further beyond the tipping point of investment and risk being matched, the more likely they are to act. And they'll do that when they're picking their targets. They want to be successful. However, if we can focus on that, we can provide a very effective delay. We can affect deterrence. If we can get to the point where they feel and perceive the investment and risks required from them outweigh the return, it's not worth it. I'm not going to do it. That's deterrence. That's what deterrence looks like. So there are various things which we haven't got time today, but we do deliver training on in terms of how the standards pick up on these. But in summary, they're the tools. The bigger the tool, the more risk in terms of acquiring those tools without being spotted. But also, if you're going to take big tools to site, how are you going to hide them? How are you going to conceal and have that element of surprise? So that's off-putting already. If you have measures of protection that require bigger tools to compromise them, you're already on the right path. So we have tools that increase in size and effectiveness. We have the working time, the delay at the bottom of the triangle. And we have the number of intruders, which generally is one. Even if you have a gang of criminals, generally you'll find one person is acting. In the UK, we've had terrorist attacks like 7/7, where a gang operated and they all did their own thing. But in more recent times, although it may be a gang, each one is acting individually. So when we had the London attacks, you had them trying to get into cafes to attack people, but you didn't have the four all attacking a cafe. You had one attacking one cafe, one going somewhere else because they were trying to maximise the objective. So generally speaking, we find it's only one. But sometimes it might be two, and so the standard covers those options. And this is summarised in an infographic, which is now available in Polish, and Jarek, who's in the room, has some copies down on his stand, but they're also available to download. But effectively, along the bottom, we have the delay, which is the base of your triangle, 1 minute, 3 minute, 5 minute, 10 minute, 15 and 20 minute delay. And up the side, we have the toolkits, which are getting larger and larger. And at the top three levels, two-person rather than one-person attack. Now, while this may look complicated, certainly compared with the European standard that has 6 grades, it's actually quite simple. So in this example of a MSyl or a LUSA portal, this achieves a C5 rating, which effectively means it stops these C-level tools for at least 5 minutes. And when we're testing it, we're testing every perceivable way of attacking through it, whereas the European standard only allows you to make one full attack. It's our responsibility to make sure we do not miss any vulnerabilities, because that's what you're relying on, is a product that will give you that 5 minute regardless of how the tools are used. So what are the benefits? Well, prime one is supporting more proportionate specification. We all have limited budgets. We need to make sure those budgets are spent wisely. So as I mentioned just now, in the European standard, sledgehammer that might be used in the jewellers only appears in RC6, which requires 20 minutes. That's far from proportionate and very costly. Whereas reality is they're probably only going to spend 1 or 3 minutes. When the new LPS standard, you could say, I want a D1, and that's specifically proportionate. The D carrying the sledgehammer is in the D tools. the 1 minute being the delay you require. So that's one of the benefits. In another example, hypothetically, this is a water treatment site. They might identify that the threat is the use of e-tools, which is 18-volt tools, sledgehammers, and other things. But the benefit for them is, depending on the location, will affect what the response is, and then they can pick a level to suit the response. But they don't have to just pick one level. They could make up the 20 by buying 4 E5 layers or an E10 layer with 2 E5s. So it's like Lego blocks. You can build a bigger wall by adding little blocks, each one giving you the value. So that takes us to the next benefit. It supports a layered approach. Whereas with the European standard, if I took RC1, although European standard doesn't cover perimeter at all anyway, but an RC3 for an outer facade and an RC4 for the inner, I can't add that up and say, well, that's a 5 minute and 10 minutes, which is what those ratings give you. That doesn't give you 15, because if I use the RC4 tools to attack the RC3 layer, I'd get in quicker than 5. So the European standard doesn't allow you to do this. The American standards have different standards for fencing to windows to doors, so again, it doesn't give you that mechanism. Whereas the European, with the LPS standard, you might identify it as being a D-level threat, and you can add up D1, D5, D10, and you've definitely got 16 minutes. In truth, you've got a lot more than that because we're not counting the time to pass between the layers. Another key benefit is the scope. It covers all elements. So this is examples of data centers. The world's biggest data center operators use it for their whole sites and locations because they can. It's the one standard in the world that you can engineer the whole site, all the layers, but holistically. So if we quickly come back to threat, what is your greatest security threat? Is it one of the many things we've heard about today? Is it drones? Is it forced entry? Is it explosives, etc.? Well, I put it to you that for many of you, as we see in the UK, the biggest threat is actually you specifying the wrong standard. And to illustrate this, I've got, well, hopefully they'll play videos of products that meet RC3. Now, RC3 is a stealth level of threat. It's the top stealth. It's 5 minutes of delay. But we see critical infrastructure operators across Europe feeling this is the European standard. We must use this. We want 5 minutes delay. This is the standard for us. So here's a couple of examples of, in the UK, these are residential doors. And hopefully that's going to play. And it's not going to play, unfortunately. What you would have seen is the claw hammer impacting the door, creating a a hole big enough to reach through, operate a handle and open the door in 20 seconds. Likewise with this door with a glazing panel that meets the European RC3 level, that level doesn't allow you to attack the glass with a hammer. And what Boric does is create a handhold by hitting the glass, straight through the glass, reaches through and opens the door in about 6 seconds. So while in the RC it's an RC3 giving 5 minutes delay, that is to stealth. So please do not use the European standard for situations where they're going to make noise, certainly at RC3. At RC4, etc., it goes beyond. So it's really important that when you specify standards, you make sure they're aligned to the threats you're trying to mitigate and the types of products you're trying to use. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Richard to explain his history and experiences of using the standard.